Hello, YouTubers. Today I'm going to talk to you about a technology that is very near and dear to my heart, which is something that I've been personally missing when I wanted to develop web applications. As you can see from previous series, previous videos that I've been recording, I've also been looking forward to building UI or web applications using ASP.NET MVC. And the framework is amazing. Like, don't get me wrong, the application is the framework has literally helped me build so many different applications through the years that I'm very grateful for. But the SPNet team and the took things to the next level. They took things to the next level when they introduced to the world, when Daniel Roth and Steve Sanderson introduced Blazor to the world. And Blazor is basically leveraging all of these experiences and all of these years and years of learning about ASP.NET MVC into a platform, into a framework, a web framework that allows back-end engineers to be able to build responsive, interactive web applications with their favorite language, C#, meaning that you don't have to learn about the tricks of JavaScript and all the three equals and the two equals and all the little things and the callbacks and all that kind of stuff about JavaScript. All you have to do is just to develop just the exact same way you were developing your backend applications, and immediately, boom, you have your own web application. But when I looked at Blazor, about a year ago, before I started, using it, and like right now, I have Blazor in over 5 projects, some of which handle millions and millions of records, to render on a web application. When I first looked at Blazor, I saw so many capabilities, but it needed a little bit of standardization from an architecture standpoint, meaning that when you are building a Blazor application, I've seen, here's the capability, here's what you can do with the framework, but how can you standardize that? How can you use that and break that apart in a way that keeps your code clean, easy to maintain, componentize and modularize your application, and all that kind of good stuff that all of these experiences that I've gathered in the past year working on Blazor for these 5 projects. And today, this is exactly what I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to start this series just so I can share with you and the rest of the world, how to build Blazor applications, and how you can actually leverage that power to your own advantage and be 100% comfortable, even if you're not a front-end engineer, even if you're not someone who has ever worked with web technology. This video is literally for you, along with people who come from a JavaScript background and whatever other technology they've been using. This video is mainly for someone who, still at the beginning trying to learn what Blazor is and how to organize their project, how to architect their project in a way that is test-driven, industrial, and easy to use. But before we dive deeper into these details, let's just get started with few things. Let's get few things out of the way. I'm going to start here with showing you the high-level architecture of a Blazor application, and then we will dive a little bit deeper into how you can use that framework to your advantage and actually build applications, enterprise applications that you can actually trust and work with. All right. So a Blazor application, basically, whether you're using it on a server or a client, I'm mainly going to be focused on the server side because that's actually what I've used in real life applications, and that's what actually I have seen being able to solve real problems. So when I break down my Blazor application, let's assume you just have an API, some API. And this API basically communicates a bunch of information for you. It doesn't matter what these information are, whatever you're needing to communicate with, right? So you have an API, and then you want to build a web application in front of that API. When I build my Blazor application, is the first thing I look at is just like how I build my APIs is to build brokers. Right, and these brokers basically are the communicators with the outside world. It's just an abstraction for those of you who have worked with me in back-end applications, and I really highly recommend, if you're watching this video, I definitely highly recommend you go and see my open source project OtripleS, because all of these concepts and all of these ideas are already implemented there. If you go to OtripleS, you will see that exact same pattern in a back-end application. You have brokers and services and controllers and models, and the brokers handling the communication with storage and giving you access to the system time and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, just like that, a Blazor application has brokers, right? And these brokers mainly handle communicating with the APIs that actually go back and forth between your actual API system and your web application. A lot of people say, well, I want to build my UI and it directly talks to storage and whatnot. That's fine. You can very simply just remove this guy and just go in here and put a storage and say, okay, then your application doesn't really talk to an API. It actually talks to the actual database with very, very slight differences in the verbosity. Instead of saying insert student, you're going to say post student. Instead of saying, select student, you're going to say, I don't know, get student, or get student to select student. Very, very little tiny bit of technology verbiage change, but other than that, it's exactly the same thing. Okay, so other brokers in your Blazor application, and these brokers basically communicate with the API and retrieve and post that information back and forth, handles all the security, authentication, authorization, all that kind of good stuff. On top of that, we have what we call services. And these services basically takes care of, adding in that business logic layer and validation on your posted data. So for instance, you're adding a new student to a database, you're sending a student to an API. Before you actually send the student an API, it would make sense that you make sure that structurally, the data that you're passing in structurally is good, not logically, structurally, meaning that if I'm posting a student and the student date of birth, let's say, is 120 years old, that's not your problem. But if the date of birth is null, this is when you actually throw the exception. When the date of birth doesn't make sense, that's when you actually need to throw the exception and say this is a validation error. You let the API contain the actual logic of the validation. Like I said, validation could be multiple things. There is structural validation, there is logical validation, and there's dependency validation. And I'm going to talk a little bit in detail about that in this video and other videos where I talk about, high level, architecture and how you can actually build industrial applications. So right, so you have services. These services talk to the brokers. They do just the last layer of validation before you actually make the trip and take off to the API and come back. All right, so you have services. On top of that, we have something called a view service. People who are familiar with the terms MVVM would actually understand that, but because I am building this for people who don't necessarily know haven't worked with web technologies, let me simplify things for you. For instance, when you're passing in a student object might come back from the API a little bit more complex and have additional information that you don't necessarily need on the UI. In other words, let's say if you're getting back from the API a student object that has creator profile, and the creator profile has an ID and a name and all kinds of different information that you don't necessarily need to show on the UI. This view service, morphs that or maps that data into something that's presentable on a page. Like for instance, you might have a creator ID, the person or submitter ID, someone who submitted the object to the database, right, to the API, and it's returning you an ID. That ID doesn't mean anything when it comes to UI. You need to show a name of a person. You say, okay, John Smith submitted this. This view service is the one that actually handles that stuff. In other words, it basically takes care raw data that's coming from the API and turns it into view data that you can actually work with. And the view service as well can communicate with multiple other services based on your need. For instance, when you're posting a student object to a view service, this view service might need some user service to capture the current user. To capture the current user in the system and say, yeah, this was submitted by John Smith or Hassan or whatever the case may be, right? On top of a view service, you want to build what I call a component. And the component is basically where the UI logic lives. UI logic, meaning that your component is basically a markup, right? Mainly markup with a backend of code that basically communicates with one service, which is the view service, and it basically helps, yeah, like communicates with that. It pushes the data to that view service, helps the view service, map the data and push that data downstream to the API, or when you're retrieving the data, it renders that data. And that component basically doesn't have a route, right? And I'll explain to you later what does that mean. Like, you can't actually route to a component. The component itself is not routable. It's not something that it is routable, but it's not something you want to go to directly. Why is that? Because a component, so this is the data pipeline in here. A component actually depends on one to many base components. Base component. So what is this base component stuff? A base component is basically just like brokers in our services. Like, a broker communicates with the outside world and abstracts away your dependency on your dependency on a particular technology. Like, for instance, you could be using, I don't know, whatever HTTP client to communicate with your API. All of this lives in your broker, right? But the reality of the situation is that if you at any point in time decide to use any other RESTful operations client, which I highly recommend RESTful Sense, you don't have to worry about that on the service layer, because that's all abstracted away from you. So your service only knows about the logic. It's exactly the same thing in here. Your component calls base component. For instance, it will call text box base. And whatever is behind that text box base is not this component's problem, right? So you could hide behind that base component a native input text box that comes with the HTML, or you could use a Telerik or a Async Fusion or whatever UI library you want to use. You abstract that completely away from your component and you hide it behind a base component. And that base component basically is the guy that handles that operation for you, so you can so easily switch between UI libraries and not have to worry about your UI, your component falling apart, because it doesn't know what's behind that base component. I'm going to show you that in a second. All right, so we have that guy, so that's base component. So what does that mean? It means that you have a one-to-many relationship kind of way, meaning that your base component, there could be a text box and a button and a, whatever the case else may be, and all of this is living behind, the component is basically requiring all of this to be communicated through the system. So that's one part. So many components. Let me put one third one in here because it's fun. Let me put just a third one in here. There it is. Because it looks pretty that way. Back. There it is. All right. So you have many base components that are being used by your main component. So let's say your main component, for instance, is a form. You're basically submitting a name and a date of birth, and you have a button that says submit. That means that you're using base text box twice, and you're using base button twice. And I'm going to show you this in a second. You're going to really love how things look like just as an overview, and then we will dive deep into it in the next sessions. But the component itself, isn't really the final guy that renders your application. It's not really the guy that actually tells you, oh, this application now is in this good shape, route to that component. This could be, for instance, something like a new student form or whatever the case may be. This guy lives in something bigger, which we call the page. We call this guy the page. And this page is actually the one that is holding the route in your application. This page is just like a controller in an API world. In your API world, you basically go and host things in a controller, and you say expose my functionality to the controller, and let the controller just handle the communication, the input and output, and the JSON mapping and all that good stuff that ASP.NET Core gives you out of the box. A page could actually pull multiple components. So let me go do the exact same thing that I did here. If I go here and I say duplicate, and then send to back, and then send this one to back as well. So this guy, and send this one to back, like this. So this one, you know what? That actually looks better. Let me take this one off and do the same thing in here. Duplicate, duplicate, and then send this to back, and send this one to back. Send this one to back like this. Yeah, that looks much better. So a page could actually be constituted of multiple components, right? So you can have multiple components that are spread across multiple pages. You know, and the same page could actually have a title and a bar at the top for your login and registration and all that, and then inside of that you could have like a nice dashboard with the the weather component and the the stocks component and your emails component, a big dashboard that has all your information that you need, and each one of those components is using its own base component to communicate through. So look at this. You have your data pipeline in here, and then you have your UI rendering pipeline. So just to give you a little bit of visual here, if I can find just a little arrow here. So here's this guy. Going up like this, that's your rendering, right? And going in this direction, that's your data pipeline. That's basically a Blazor application. Industrial, single responsibility, test-driven application that you can actually use and work with, and you can actually, so easily, add in more components or remove in more components. Now that everything is written in C#, now I'm interested, into standardizing this and making it even better. A component can be used also by multiple pages. So let me go down here and say, here's duplicate. Now that I know how to do this, let's send this guy to the back. And now let's send this guy to the back as well. So multiple pages could use multiple components, and multiple components use multiple base components. This sounds so great on paper, right? Let me give this guy a little bit of visual for you, so you would you'd actually like this a lot. So this is basically your pipeline. We have your pipeline. This guy is the outside world. We don't care about that. And then this here is basically your rendering layer. Okay, this is the theory. This is great. Let's sit together and build a simple. Let's initialize a simple Blazor application. Like I said before, we're mainly focused on building a server-side Blazor application, but as soon as the WebAssembly part, is finalized and ready to use and all that kind of stuff, we're definitely going to have a similar series, that takes care of all that stuff and make sure things, are the way they're supposed to. So let's just, walk through real quick the initialization of a Blazor application. So I'm going to start Visual Studio here. All right, and then I'm going to go here and start create new project. So here's a new project, and let's build Blazor app. This is a Blazor app. And then let's call this OtripleS. Like I said, OtripleS is a project that I am working on. It's an open source project for the children of the world. And let's call this OtripleS.portal. Right, so that's my solution name, and then the project name is OtripleS.portal.web. All right, so this is my web application. Let's go ahead and create OtripleS. So here you go. So you have the WebAssembly part where you can use that. You could use ASP.NET Core hosted progressive web application, which we are going to be visiting as well. And you can have the Blazor server-side app, which is what we're going to be focused on today. So let's just go ahead and create this guy. All right. Let's just talk a little bit about the structuring of your Blazor application, right? The structuring here is very important because what I'm basically focused on mainly is to make sure that you properly structure your Blazor application in a way that is easier for you to work with as you move forward. If you look here from a first glance, you will notice that your Blazor application is coming with bunch. Let me restart my Visual Studio. It seems to be doing something weird. Let me start this again. OtripleS. There you go. All right. So in here, I want to restructure my work a little bit. You have data in here, you have shared, you have pages, you have all that kind of stuff that some of it you want to get rid of and some of it you want to keep, right? Normally, this is pretty cool because basically the ASP.NET team, when they create a project like this, they want you to get up and running with a real life example. So when you actually run your application, and you probably want to run the application before you do any changes, just to make sure that you're basically you have a working Blazor application before you make any of the changes that I'm going to tell you about in a second. So here's your Blazor application. It's basically going to give you this nice, full, web application. You could, click in here and see data coming in and all that kind of stuff, which is fantastic, right? But you want to start your project from scratch. You actually want to get, up and running with brand new stuff. So we're going to do a little bit of cleanup, a little bit of gutting in here. So I'm going to throw away this data part completely out. This guy will go out. And then just a teeny tiny bit of structuring here that's really important. And then we want to throw out the counter, the fetch data. We're going to keep the index in here because it's important. So counter goes out, and then we have a data, and then we want to basically reset. I don't want the nav menu or the survey prompt, so all of these go out completely. And then I want to basically start building the actual structure of my application. So I'm going to create a new folder in here, and I'm going to call this folder Views. It's the old school MVC. This is my views. And then in my views, I'm basically going to go ahead and do a little bit of work in here. Let's see. So first and foremost, I want to move my pages right inside these views. The only folder that I'm going to keep at the top is shared, but everything else is going to have to move, right? So there's this part, and then pages. So you got this guy, but now your pages are indiscoverable, because they have moved into another layer. So a little bit of reconfiguration is needed. But before I do that, let's just remove all the errors. Let's just get rid of all the errors. Hello world, welcome to new app, and then let's see, there's a bunch of dependencies. There's the imports in here, and in these imports we might see some stuff that we don't need. Let's just try to rebuild our application just to make sure things are functional. Yeah, we are building correctly. And then in startup, let's get rid of all these comments. I really hate comments. If your code needs comments, other than you documenting your API for your Swagger generation, or you're building a library that has a closed source or proprietary source, I would need to know why you are adding a comments in your code. Anyway, so you have this guy. You will notice in here there's an interesting thing. We want to be able to have, like right now, if you run your application after you do that little structuring, we still have some errors in here. Let's clean this up. Yeah, we don't have data anymore. We don't need that. Let's do a little bit of cleanup. Right click, analyze, and clean your entire application. Beautiful, beautiful. And then let's run our application. This application will fail simply because you have moved the index from its location. So the index page, it says I looked in this host area and I couldn't find anything. Where did you hide your index page? I can't find where it's supposed to be. So what we're going to do here, I want you to focus with me, is basically we're going to go type in here services.add razor pages, and then in the options area we're going to go ahead in here and say options.root directory, because that's where your root directory is going to be, and then you're going to say /views/pages. So that's the root directly where things are supposed to be. Right? So now when I run my application, I should be able to see hello world or whatever message I have in there. Let's go see that. There you go. Here you go. Hello world, welcome to your new app. There's still some stuff in my page that I don't like. Let's go clean up. Let's go do a little bit more cleanup in here. The main layout of the application probably has some stuff in it. Let's just go ahead and completely destroy all of that. I don't need that guy. This guy goes out. This is my div main, about, and all that. I don't need that either. I'm just gonna slap in the body in here, which is basically your index page. Now let's run this stuff and see how things look like. It'll be just plain, very plain web application that doesn't have absolutely anything in it except just, there you go. Welcome to your new app, hello world. This is, okay, this way we basically really reset our Blazor application into square zero. Right now, let's just go ahead and build the rest of the folders that we need. So I'm just going to go ahead in here and build brokers and build my services. And then I need to build my, inside the views, I'm going to build bases. That's base components. And then I'm going to build my components. So bases, components, and pages, right? So it's base components, and then components and pages. All right. Now let's go ahead and start adding a framework. Well, let's first talk about brokers, right? I need a simple broker that helps me just hit an endpoint and create a student object. Right, something as simple as that, right? Just go ahead in here and say under brokers, I'm just going to say API. And under API, I'm just going to go ahead and say use new item, interface, API broker. This is my API broker right here, right? And I want the implementation of that API broker. So let me go ahead in here and say class. This is API broker, like this. This is the guy that basically handles the communication with the outside world, right? For those of you who worked with me before or actually saw my open source projects, they would understand, that we heavily leverage partial classes to make sure we have unobtrusiveness, in our work, like a very single responsibility, even within the same class itself. If it's handling something across, multiple entities, we want to make sure we separate those properly. All right, so it's API broker, this is all great. Now let's go ahead and pull in an interesting library. It's an open source library called RESTful_Sync. And RESTful_Sync will basically be a library that helps us properly have communication with APIs. What's interesting about this library, though, is that, when I built this library earlier this year, my intent was to make sure that, if you're getting an error code, you actually receive it as an exception, in the form of an exception. So if you're getting a bad request or URL not found or bad gateway or maximum capacity achieved or whatever the case may be, I wanted to make sure that when you have this library in, you actually are aware of the fact that you can actually so easily on your service side handle that exception and properly program against that exception, whatever the API that you're communicating with may be. So this RESTful_Sync also have this great ability to just handle the the parsing of the response. So just give it the model that you want it to parse, and then don't have to worry about reading a response asynchronously or doing any of that stuff. All you really have to do is just focus on the things that matter the most, right? Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't do redundant stuff that you don't need to do. Just focus on the things that matter the most. All right. So now with RESTful_Sync, we want to basically add it in as an HTTP client, and then we want to go ahead and basically so easily implement it and integrate it with the system. So let's just go ahead in here in our startup.cs and let's initialize a bunch of services. Since this is only one line, let's make this a one-liner like this, and let's just go ahead in here and start adding a few things. So this is services.add add transient, add scoped. Oh, add scoped. For those of you who don't know the difference between transient and singleton and scoped, scoped is for the same user, same session. Transient is per request, and singleton is once and for all. So you probably want to go with scoped most of the time, but if you decide to take a different route, just be aware of what you're doing. Don't do something you don't understand, especially if you're building some serious applications. All right, so add scoped, this is that, and I forgot to actually say this implements this guy, so this is iAPI broker. So we have this guy, this is great. And then in my API broker, basically, I also want to initialize my my HTTP client, right? So let's just go ahead and initialize that. I'm just gonna go in here and say services dot add HTTP client. And my HTTP client is something called iRestful API factory client. And this is RESTful API factory client right here. Right? All of this is coming from RESTful Synths. And then in here, I get to set whatever I want to set, in my configurations. All right. At this point here, I actually need to set up configurations so I know what endpoint I need to communicate with and be able to actually switch the endpoint based on the environment that I'm in, right? So if I am in a dev environment, I should be able to communicate with the dev endpoint or production endpoint or whatever the case may be. So let's go ahead and just add in here real quick some information. So I'm just going to go here and say after logging API configurations, right? And then here's the URL. Later on, I'm going to talk about the security and how you can secure this and capture the current user token and all that kind of good stuff. Blazor actually does things out of the box that are amazing when it comes to that stuff. But for the time being, this is what it is. So here's a URL. It's some URL that I'm going to be communicating with. This is API configurations, which means that I need a models folder. And in that models, I'm just going to add in here configurations. And in the configurations, this is how you actually, properly read your configurations from your JSON, not to hard code it or go look for the string or any of that. Just map it to hard code. It's not really a big deal. So let's just go here and create something called local configurations. And inside local configurations, I'm just going to create another one. I'm going to call it another class. I'm going to call it API configurations. Notice that API configurations will be exactly the same structure as the structure that I put in there in the app settings development. So let's just go here and say prop API configurations. API configurations. Here you go. So we have this guy. And then inside API configurations, I only put in there the URL. So just string URL like that. What is this? What is this magic? We basically went in here and we said there's something called API configurations. Inside of it, there's a URL. This is a JSON format, which means that in startup.cs, if I want to go in here and say string URL like that, and then you have this configuration guy, which is very, very powerful. You could go here and say, configuration dot git like this, and then you can put in there local configurations. Right? Look, if I do dot, it'll give me API configuration. If I do dot again, it gives you the URL. Right? Let's clean this up a little bit. I don't like janky things. I don't like things that are not done properly. So this is local configurations, like that. So here's my configurations. And then this is under 120 characters, so I think it's okay. And then in here, I want to go and say, out of my local configurations, I basically want to and retrieve the URL. So that means that this, this guy should be called client. My apology. This is client. So this client in here, .base address equals new URI, and it takes, I think it takes a URI, base address, yep, URI, and I don't want system to be in here. I want to pull that. And then in here I can go and say, let's push that by 1. String API URL local configurations dot local configurations dot API configuration dot URL. Here's our guy. And then in here I can pass in here API URI. So I set up my base address, right? Out of code hygiene perspective, I like to containerize, I like to keep my configure services in a clean state, meaning that one statement, one statement, one statement. So when people looking at the configurations, they don't have to step through 4 or 5 lines to get to the next mission or the next statement, So let's take all of this and just say extract method, add HTTP client. Here's one guy. And in here, let's go in here and say add root directory, right? And because of these two are private, let's push him to the bottom under the public. So let's push all of these guys down. Some people believe that the method that you use should be declared at the top, and that's a legit argument. I have respect for these people, even though I don't necessarily follow it. Because when I'm looking at something, like my perspective is that when I look at a method, I want to look at the public methods first, the ones that I am looking for that I can use outside, versus people who say no, you can't use a function before you declare it. And I totally understand that. This comes from the C and C++ world, from the ye olden days where your actual compiler would bark at you and would tell you, hey, you can't use that because it's not defined yet or something like that. I personally think if it was up to me, I would just put them in a partial class and say this is my private. So now we don't have to argue whether they're on the top or the bottom. You could just put them in a partial class and be done with them. You could do that. For the time being, I'm just going to keep it this way. So this is your API broker. Let's add these critical things at the top, and then we have our API brokers. But that means that my API broker now, in order for it to be able to communicate, right, it needs to have a dependency on this iRESTful API factory client, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing, along with some little magic, some other things that are really, really fun to do. So let's just go and do that. Let's go into our API controller, API broker in here, and let's just do private read-only iRESTful API factory client. So this is my API client. And then here's a CTOR. And my CTOR basically is going and saying, let's see, so this is this guy. Let's clean this up a little bit. And in here in my using dependency injection, I'm just going to go and say iRESTful API client. And this is API client, like this. Right? And this RESTful API client basically is nothing but the API client that we pass in as private class member. And because there's nothing else that we're going to be doing here for now, there will be a lot of stuff that we're going to be doing later. I am basically setting up my API client like that. All right, cool. So that's one piece. Now let's go ahead and jump into the next thing. The next thing here is basically to go to this API client and just add in a little bit of work around the functions that I need to implement. So in here, basically, I want to go and say, in here, I'm just going to go and say private async value task. Value task is much faster than task, but you can't use it in the test as far as I know, and this takes just a generic type, and these are basically the CRUD operations. So I'm going to go and say get async, right? And this get async basically takes a relative URL, and then out of that you're going to go and say this.API client get content async with whatever you're passing in, and you're pushing in that relative URL in here. Here it is. And this guy needs to be awaited because it's asynchronous, right? So await this guy. Right, so that's one piece. Right, we have that guy. I think we need a T in here for the type. Yep. And by the way, just something my friend David Pilara taught me. This can be anything you want. It's not really in stone. I can literally say Hassan, and you can go here and say Hassan, and you can put in here and put Hassan. It's whatever you want. It's just commonly used as a T, meaning that it's a generic type that you can use, something that you can replace with a type. So don't get, fixated on the, terminology here. It can be anything you want. Commonly used this way. Okay, so async value task. Here's another one, and this is post async. And post async now is going to take a relative URL and the content that you're posting. Content that you're posting. Again, this guy is a generic guy like this. Here you go. And then await this.api client.post content async. And this guy takes a T type and then give it the relative URL and the content. There you go. Right, so it's very easy methods that we're going to be using to just communicate just the CRUD operations, basically all the CRUD operations that you may need to basically communicate with an external API. Now let's go to the next thing, private async value task T, and this is what this is. Let's do the put async, right? Put async, again string relative URL T content await this.api client dot put content async with the T, give it the relative URL and give it the content, and so on and so forth. You're basically gonna do the rest of this with the rest, and this is actually like as I am building this, like this is the thing about this demo or this presentation is that I'm actually initializing this for an actual open source project that I hope for you to be a part of. But while I'm doing that, I'm using this as a learning experience so you can actually learn about using this into a real life application that you want to build. So while I'm actually typing this, I'm actually working on a real project that I want you to take a look at. So okay, so there's private async value task. What's the last thing we want to do? We're going to do delete async, right? Something like that. And this guy will take a relative URL. I don't think in the delete you need to post anything, at least if you're doing it properly. So await this.api client.delete client and then delete content async, something like that, and then give it the relative URL. There might be cases where you need to do that. I still don't. What do I return in here? I think I return just a value task. Okay, in this case here I actually want to return something, so here's a T. Yeah, there you go. Okay. All right, great. So I built those little methods, that basically abstract away basically the CRUD operations. Obviously, this guy includes both retrieve by ID and retrieve, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, I just basically set up my broker. So when I go and say I want to set up communication for my students endpoint or my assignments endpoint or classroom endpoint, whatever the case may be, it will be there and it will be easy to work with. Okay, so this is all set up. Let's just go ahead and set also the testing project. So here's a new project. XUnit. We're going to be using XUnit with BUnit, and we're going to use a bunch of other stuff that are really cool to use. So this is going to be, OtripleS .portal.web.tests.unit, right? Because it will be tests acceptance and tests integration, all that. It might give you a little bit of a hard time when you're doing the pipeline setup, because the pipeline setup automatically is set to find tests something.csproj, right? And we don't have tests.csproj. We actually have tests.unit.csproj. So it's going to be a little bit of work, but it's not really too terrible. Let's go ahead and pick up the copyrights for that while we're at it, right? So let's just put that in here. I didn't actually put it in here. The beautiful thing about Visual Studio is that it has this IntelliCode feature that actually knows immediately, that if you're using a copyright or whatever the case may be, it'll immediately catch it. Meaning that I put it once. Now every time I go and do Control period like this, it'll say add banner. So you don't have to copy and paste and copy and paste and do all of that stuff. You don't have to do none of that, right? So let's clean this guy up and let's do that. I still don't know if there's a way where it does that across every project, but obviously, as we are touching files and as we go, we'll make sure that it has that banner in there. All right. Not to get away from the subject, now in our unit test project, we might need, few things to install, few things that are very important for us. Obviously, the current template of Visual Studio that gives you the XUnit project seems to be a little bit out of date when it comes to the libraries that you're using, like the XUnit runner and all that kind of stuff. It's not fully out of date. It's just, there are new versions that you could actually upgrade to. So I'm just going to upgrade these libraries real quick while we're at it. Here we go. All right. And there's a bunch of other things that we want to install. So we want BUnit. And BUnit is basically how I'm going to show you. You can actually test drive I think it's in the pre-release. There it is. Eagle Hansen. I like this guy. This guy's smart. He does great things. So let's install this guy. Let's BUnit. Alright, so you have BUnit. And then there's a bunch of things that I also want to install while I'm at it. I don't know what's this test SDK. Sure, let's do that. So we have that in. Okay, and then let's install a bunch of other things like fluent assertions. Fluent assertions. Dum. Come on. You can do it. 64 gigs of RAM. Here you go. There you go. And then we also want mock, obviously, the king of it all, to help us, abstract away, mock our dependencies and be able, like, they all hand over to each other, like this bundle of libraries that you're using to test your applications. If you're following particular standards and guidelines and proper practices for software development, they will help you. These libraries will just make your life easier. When you're building your application, you don't have to have a lot of heartburn over why this library isn't doing what I'm trying to do. And if there is no library that's doing what you're trying to, just go develop one. This is how I ended up building exceptions and RESTful synths, and I have a whole bundle of other libraries that I want to actually implement, that will make developers' lives easier. So I think I got everything. Let's just take a quick look here. Maybe I forgot something. There's also Dynamics, and while this library is an abandoned library, not a lot of people are using it these days. It's actually, to me, it's much better than Bogus, because Bogus requires you actually to, like when I tried Bogus, it forces you to actually set up. You can't just generate for an object. You have to actually explicitly set up every single property or every single type generation, which seems a lot of hassle to me. Instead of just making a filler and let it fill things up for me, I should have both options. Someone else, created another library just to do that. So why would I, replace one library with two libraries? That's just insane. I'm trying to have as little dependencies as possible, not the other way around. So until folks at Bogus decide to fix things up, I'm gonna stick with Dynamics, even though it doesn't have much contribution at the moment. It does what I need, and I'm happy with it. Okay, so I have BUnit, fluent assertions. Am I running on .NET 5? Yeah, this happens with me all the time. If you install .NET 5 on your computer, Visual Studio will assume that this is what you want to build with, let's stick to let's stick to 3.1 in here for now, and maybe not the alpha releases of things. Maybe. So okay, so you have dynamics, I have mock, I have SDK, I have all of that stuff. Let's just build things up and make sure things are working as they are expected to work, hopefully. There you go. And normally when I build my unit test projects, this is just the initiation. There will be a long series of talking about each and every piece of this, but you know, when I build my stuff, I like to leave things, signs that tells me that things are working properly, right? So let me take this guy out. This is hello world, and in here I'm just gonna build two folders. The things that matter to me, that everything else is just an abstraction around. There are services and there are components. And that's really all I care about, components for testing. And I'm just gonna move one of those in here. So when I push this up in my pipelines, it tells me that it's actually working. This is delete me, right? So this is delete me, and inside that delete me, it's just say assert true condition true. This is a dummy test that when you're initializing a new project, you want to leave that dummy test in there so you know that your pipeline is actually picking up the right projects and running the right tests. If you don't do that, what's going to happen is that you're going to start developing features, and then all of a sudden you'll discover that your pipeline is not set up properly. So if your task is to set up a project, you want to make sure that your project is working properly before you give it out to a whole bunch of engineers and tell them, hey, go develop, and then they run into problems and they tell you, hey, do you even know what you're doing? So okay, so we have this. I set up my project. I have my APIs set up. Maybe we also need to add in a logging broker. So that's loggings. Logging or loggings. I think logging is fine. This is logging broker. And there is also logging broker. Logging broker. So here's a banner, and the logging broker, there isn't really much to do in there with the logging broker. I'm just gonna find this in another project that I have. I'm just gonna talk about it a little bit because why not? In the logging broker, I basically go from the least severity to the highest, right? So you go from information to trace to debug to warning to error to critical. And each and every one of those has its place and time, and I'm going to talk to you about each and every one of those in detail very, very soon. So there's this guy, and let's just go ahead and add this file. So this is good, and then let's just slap in there just an implementation, which basically is a dependency on iLogger, which we're going to add in our startup.cs. This is just initializing your Blazor application. We haven't done anything, we didn't do any magic yet. We're just initializing the thing to get things going for us. Okay, here we go. iLogging broker. This is all good and dandy, and the project is set up. Now we need to initialize this in startup.cs, right? Because if you don't have that, then things are not going to work out for you, right? Let's see. So in startup.cs, I have the ad server side. I have all that. These are brokers. So services, add scoped, iLogging broker, and then let's see, this is the logging broker, like that. And then probably would be useful if I say services.add scoped iLogger, and then logging, logger with a logging broker in it, like this. Right, maybe put that down there. Yep, there you go. API, logging, logger broker. There's also a need. You also need a datetime broker. So let's just go ahead and add a datetime broker. Like when you're testing your services, you probably want to be aware of, being able to basically mock the datetime. so your service doesn't actually rely on an actual dependency of the date time. So let's abstract that away. Let's put in here time or date time. Date times, something like that. And let's just go in here and say class interface iDateTime broker. All it's doing is it's just reading from your system, but it's going to be very important down the road, because you don't want when you're running your tests, you don't want your test to actually try to rely on the actual system date time, because that's really a good recipe for a flaky test. And I'm going to talk to you about this a little bit in detail in this series. But for the time being, here we go. This is public datetime broker, and this is all good. And in the datetime broker, really, let's just make sure we implement this iDateTime broker. Also, let's make sure our logging, our logging is good. Datetime broker. Let's just go here and say this guy returned a datetime offset, which is basically datetime done right. Like my friend Roberto Bortolosi would say, the first time it didn't work out, but this time we gotta get it right. So the get current date time, right, and then let's implement that. Let's just control period. All it's doing really is just reading the time system, the time from the current system, but we can mock it now. We can do whatever we want with it. So this is datetime offset.utc now. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, some of the stories around date times. When you use current date time or current local, because now you're building a client. You're building a web application, right? So how are you going to display the time to your client? Are you going to display it in UTC? That might be confusing, because now they're going to have to think, what's the local time compared to that? It would be 3 in the morning here, but it's displaying 5 in the morning, or 5 in the afternoon. It's just there's a little bit of nuances to it that I can't wait for the next video to talk to you about it. Anyway, so we set up our API broker, we set up our datetime broker, we set up our configurations. Let's run a little bit of cleanup, because I see, usings in here that we don't need. And then we have a main layout, right? And then we have bases, components, pages, and all that kind of stuff. Great. And when we run our tests actually run, and they give us green, hopefully. Here we go. So this is green. This is fantastic. So we set up everything, and while we're at it, just how we set up the brokers. Let me walk you through setting up the bases in the views area. Right. I'm just going to set up a couple of base components, and then in the next video, I'm going to show you how we're going to use that base into the component, and how we're going to run our unit tests and all that kind of stuff. So let's just start with something very simple. I could start with a Razor component, and I'm just going to call it text box base. Text box base. Now, before we talk about this any further, you're going to see a lot of people, and I want you to focus with me on this, because this is happening a lot when I see in a lot of Blazor applications. A lot of people go and write code in here, and I know it's cool. It's cool to go and do this, and then go here and say, oh, I have a label, and here's the X value that I'm communicating, and all that kind of stuff. I understand that this is nice, right, and easy. You're looking at the same place, and your C# code is there, and your HTML code is there, and all that. But if you're trying to really build something that is unobtrusive, meaning that your UI lives in one place and the backend for that UI lives in another place, what you really want to do is to use partial classes, meaning I can go here and write a class, and I can type in here text box base.razor.cs. What happens is that this class becomes a part of this UI, so you don't have to do that stuff anymore. Instead of doing that, I can go in here in the backend in here and say this is a partial, right? And I can go in here and define some X property, right? And if you go in the back here, you'll see that this guy knows exactly about that X property that you did. So you have back end, front end. Some people will say, well, I don't want to jump back and forth, right? It's a lot of work for me. Well, you know, we have this really cool thing in C# in Visual Studio that allows you to see the back end and the front end. Just like when you develop mobile applications. Like think about it when you're doing a Xamarin application or a Windows Forms application or whatever application you're doing, you know, you have a back end and a front end. You know, even in the MVC world, you used to build like a view controller, and then on top of it, there's that view page, right? You can do the same thing with Blazor as well so easily just by simply creating this partial class. Yeah, see, it nests right under your page. And even Visual Studio, like the guys did a great job with the rendering in here. You can actually create a partial class that is an extension of this existing class, and so easily you can add whatever code you want in there. And because we're adding like a text box base, let's just go ahead and build a few things in this text box base that allows us, you know, to better understand and communicate, you know, what's happening in the text box. So the first thing I want to do in here, I want to add in a little parameter. And I'm going to tell you in a second what that parameter is going to do. It's going to blow your mind. You're going to love it. If you have never seen this before, you're going to love it. So this is a string, and this is my value. So there's a value that goes inside of a text box, right? Which means if I have a text box, just native input type text box, and then I have a value in here, I can add in that guy in here like this. And that's my text box. I'm abstracting away this guy because at any point in time I want to use a third-party library to handle my rendering of the front of my application. It's going to be very easy to do that, right? So that's the input value. I'm not going to leave it like that. I'm just letting you know how things are going to look like, right? So that means basically if I want to have a duplex back and forth communication, maybe I want to make this bind value. You can see the Blazor annotation here starting to show up, this green annotation. And this bind value basically is saying whatever you pass in or whatever is being passed in, it's going to be binding. This variable is going to be a binded value or bounded value to this UI component. All right, let me add some banners in here. I love banners. Right? And this is the value. There's one more thing I want to do. I want to give a couple of functionalities. It's going to help us with the testing, right? So let's just go ahead and here and say prop void set value. And this is basically a function that's going to help me, right, set value to my text box. It's going to help a lot when we're doing unit tests. I'm going to show you that in a second. So this dot value equal value. You could change the variable name if you want. This looks good enough for me. So this is value, this is set value. It's beautiful, right? This is how I built a base component, something that I can replace anytime I want without having any problems. And I'm going to show you what we're going to do with that in a second. It's a very, very short second. I think these input things have something in here called placeholder as well. So let's just put the placeholder here as well. So let's say in here, I'm going to call it placeholder. And this guy will error out because I don't have a placeholder. Just wait for it. If it doesn't error out, that would be embarrassing. Yeah, there you go, placeholder. Which means I need to go in the back here and go add in another parameter. And you can make your parameters optional as well. You can just make them nullable or not pass them at all. And it's still going to be fine. So this is string. And this is placeholder. So that placeholder basically helps you add in something. This guy will disappear. Look. See how your code is clean now? Instead of adding, you know, code, while I think it's great to try something out, you know, if you go type that stuff in here, it would look really weird. Instead, just keep your HTML, keep your markup, and keep your backend. Keep your C# code on the CS file, and keep your markup in the Razor file. Things are going to be much, much cleaner and much, much better this way. All right, so that's a base component, right? technically my setup is done. Technically all the work that I need to do here is kind of done, right? But I want to show you a little something, on top of that, just so you understand how things work. Just so you understand how to, just a little teaser for the next video so you understand how things work, because we still have to build services and test drive these services, and then we want to build maybe a view service, and then on top of that we want to add in the stuff that we want to add. So let's just go ahead in here. Let's say I have a component in here, and I'm going to call it student form component. Student form component. And this student form component relies on some base components, right? So for instance, I can go in here and say, let me build a little bit of backend for that student base component, just so you understand what I'm trying to accomplish here, right? So here's a class, student base, student form component .razor.cs, like this, right? And this guy basically is also partial. This guy will complain, student form component, oh, it didn't list right under it, I must have misspelled it. Let me kill that guy, and let me rename, copy, and let's just go in here and say class student form component.razor.cs. Here you go. Now this guy will complain because there's already a class in the system that's called that, so I'm just going to call it partial. Also very important, don't forget to say inherits component base, because it's going to play a role later into controlling the uninitialized. Some people say, well, it's partial, it's already in student form component.razor. So yeah, but that's not visible to the engineers. Like the engineer, the coder, the person who's writing the code, they don't know about that. Like there's an override function in here that says uninitialize and uninitialize async, right? We want to be able to basically go and say, this is coming from this component base, so you don't have to be confused about that. Anyways, I'm just going to go in here and create a property, and I'm going to call it, this is a text box base. And this text box base, let's call it student name text box. And this student name text box, I'm going to pass it as a reference to the component base that I'm using. And that's how I'm going to test my stuff, right? Meaning that if I go in here and go and say text box base, and I can here use a usings, or I can use it in my, I can go here and say at usings. You can do it this way, or you can use it in your references and use it globally. So you don't have to do it again. Like if you go into your imports, where's my imports at? Right here. I can go in here and just do using OtripleS.portal.web.views.bases. I think basis, that's it. If I go back here, I don't have to worry about that anymore. It's still going to be understandable. And this guy, right, this guy is going to have a ref to student, see, student name text box, like this. And I can give it a label while I'm at it, but I want to test drive this. I want to show you how this works, how all of this works. So this is a student text box base, and you're passing in the student name text box. And inside of this guy, now there is a relationship between this guy and this other guy, right? Like this, right? But in order to test drive this, I'm going to take this out. I'm just going to say I have a text box base in here, right? And let me clean this up a little bit. And now let's go and set up some tests for my component. Again, this is a teaser. We're going to dive a lot more in the details of this, but for the time being, let me show you how this works. So under components, I'm going to build in a root test file that's called student form component tests, right? I'm going to show you the magic of bunit in here real quick. So you have this guy, and this is public class. And this public class doesn't really have, I don't really have any service dependencies yet. I'm not really calling any service dependencies, so I'm not doing that yet. But we're going to get to that in a second. In this guy, I'm going to build my component that I want to test. But before I do that, I want to inherit from something called test fixture. Test. What's it called? Let me try to remember. Test fixture or something like that. Or test context. Sorry, test context. Test fixture is for the acceptance test. Okay, so it's this guy. And then I'm going to go and say private I read only. I rendered. Right, I probably don't need read only because I'm going to initialize it. And so rendered component. And this I rendered component has student form component, which is going to come from the project that I'm working on. Student form component, like this. And this here is going to be my rendered student form component. It's going to be my guy. Good, all good. Now let's do a CTOR in here. And let's initialize this guy. This guy doesn't need a lot to be initialized. It's very simple. It's very easy to initialize. We're not even going to do anything in there. The only thing that we just want to be aware of is that whether we want to add any dependent services or not. In our case here, there's nothing actually to do. So I'm going to leave this as is. You know what? Just for the purpose of this demo even, I'm going to... Yeah, there's a lot of things I want to share with you. Let's just start with this, right? And then in here, I'm just going to go ahead and write one test. And I'm going to call this this file student form component tests.logic.cs. I'm going to talk about that logic in a second. Here's a banner. Here's a partial class. This is a partial class of the root class, so I can separate, exception handling from validation from everything else. And let's just write a simple test fact in here. Here's a fact. And then public void should initialize component. So this is the state where the component isn't in place yet. There's nothing in there, right? And in this initialize component, I could basically go and say var, student initial student form component. And I'm just initializing my student form component in here. I'm not doing anything. I didn't really render anything. Nothing, So this is given when. And then in here, I'm going to go and say initial student form component dot instance, dot student text box should be null, because this guy, it didn't render yet. It didn't load yet. So there's nothing going on there, right? This guy should be null. If I run my test right now, this guy should come back as true, because we didn't really render anything. Missing modifier, I probably forgot something. Let's see. Public partial class. Let's go back here and run our tests. This is the stage before your component even render. And I'm going to talk to you about the states, loading and content and error and all that kind of stuff shortly. There you go. Alright, so this guy should pass because this guy is null. Now let's write in another test in here. And this test basically will say should render component. Now things are different. For starters, it's really, really, really important that you understand that every component through their life cycle goes through 3 states, right? One of 3 states: loading or content or error. So it really, let's bring back the architecture here for a second. Let's talk about this because this is important. If you have a component in here, this component can go from loading. Every component starts with loading, but it takes one of 2 routes. It could either go into the content state, or it could go into the error state. What does that mean? Any component that you view on the internet, If it errors out, say sorry, you know, this URL is not working because 1, 2, 3, 4, and it is what it is, and life is hard, right? Or you load it and it actually gives you some content, right? These states are very, very important in the UI world because it helps you determine that you're sending the right signal into your application. And we're going to talk a little bit about this in detail in the next video. But for the time being, you know, I just want to show you a very initial case for that stuff. So I'm going to go into my components in here. I'm going to create a folder. I'm going to call it basics. And this basics component basically is it's an Uber component, a container for all your components that basically handles these states that I'm talking to you about. In the models as well, I'm just going to go in here and create something called basics. And in this basics guy, I'm going to create a file. It's an enum really. I'm going to call it component states. So here's an enum. And this enum has either loading, content, or error. 3 states. Nothing has changed there, right? And then I'm going to add in the good-hearted engineers stuff. And let's just go here and clean this up. And this component states, if you look at the basic component, let's just call this new item. Basic component. This basic component basically, well, let's delete that first and let's create a razor component first. So here is a basic component. And this basic component will have a C# file behind it. .razor.cs. And this basic component is going to have those 3 states as parameters that you pass in. When you pass in that parameter, it's going to determine based on the parameter that you pass in which fragment that it's supposed to render. It's all C#. You're going to love it. Just wait. So in here, I'm going to go and say this is a partial. This guy is inheriting from component base. And we have a parameter. It's like building a function, except that the entire class takes a parameter instead of just a function. And this guy here takes something called component states. State. These are the state, loading, error, content, and all that kind of good stuff. But in addition to that, it takes in other things that are very, very important. Fragment, there's something called a render fragment. This is the render fragment for loading, right? And there's another render fragment for, we probably just need, since the exception is in place, let's just have a fragment for, let's see. Yeah, these render fragments, you could have one for render fragment for loading. And here's another one for content and another one for error. So this is content and this is error. Each one of those fragments is going to take care of your application based on the state that you're in. Based on the state that you're in, right? So there's a state, loading, content, and error. And then at the end of all that, we basically want to go here and say, excuse me, we want to go and say this guy for this basic component, it's really based on the component state that you're rendering in. You know, it's going to determine what to load in your application. This is something that you can easily test against and take care of. So this is basic component. And let's go in here and just go and determine what we're going to do with this. So in here, in the back end in here, I'm just going to build a little function that returns a render fragment. And this render fragment is basically going to be called get fragment based on the input parameter. And then let's use some C# magic in here, and let's go and say return, right, as state, switch. So this is the new C# stuff. And inside this guy, the initial state here would be, let's just say this error. And then the state that is loading, it will return a loading fragment, right? It's a loading state. So this is component state.loading will return a loading fragment, and then the component state.content will return a content fragment. I think it's like that. And then there's this guy. The last thing you want to do is just call this guy outside in here. So just go in here and you say, take away all of that and just say get fragment. Like this. That's it. So what is this guy doing? It's basically based on what you pass in into your component, it will determine based on the state what you're determining. So that's a basic component. Right, so there's a basic component, and then we need something to abstract away that work. And I'm going to come back to you on that one in a second. Alright, so that means in my student form component, I can very easily go here and say, I need states to handle my component. So I'm going to go in here and say prop component state like this. This basically explains the states of your component. Based on the component, you're going to render one thing or another, right? And we're going to talk about that in a second. Let's just go back to our tests. We built the state, we talked about the state, great. So in here given, here's what we want to do. We want to say the component state expected state once the component renders should be content, right? Now when that component renders, so this dot rendered, this is what we're getting here, say render component with student form component. So now we're rendering it. We're actually running that component to render in here. Then determine that this dot rendered component dot state dot instance dot state should, this is from Fluent Assertion, be equivalent to expected state. And you can also say should be, because it's going to be the same, it's primitive type, it's going to be the same value in memory. But you can be should be equivalent to, that's fine too. Also, we want to make sure that this text box is actually hooked up to an actual UI component. So I'm going to go here and say instance dot student text box should not be null. It shouldn't be null. It should be an actual component. And maybe for the placeholder, let's just test that one as well. We should go here and say this dot rendered component dot instance dot student name text box should, oh, not just the text box, the label, then the placeholder. There it is, placeholder should be equivalent to, and in here I can put the expected student text box as string expected, let's say random student random text, and here's where you can use your dynamics. You can go here and say new mnemonic string get value, so it's completely randomized. I don't even know if you have to do it that way, because we want it to always be a particular value. Not for this, maybe for an input value that we're gonna use. So let's just skip that for now and just say student name or something. So the label will say student name, right? Or name rather. Let's say name, something like that, right? So that's pretty much a test that is going to fail because my student text box is not in the right place. It's not hooked up to an actual instance on the back end. This is where I'm going to control what values are being passed in and all that. And also, what I'm noticing is that, we're testing whether the component is in the right state. And I'm also testing in here that the text box is having the right label. So let me do Control RT in here real quick. We have a little error somewhere. Let's fix it. I need a comma in here. There you go. Let's go here and run this. Control RT. There you go. And that guy should fail. And it should fail obviously because the student text box is null, the state is not content, and all that kind of good stuff. Let's just see here. Here you go. Here you go. So here's what we have. Content value is supposed to be 1, but found 0, and so many other good stuff. It basically stopped at the first failure and said, I failed. While we're at it, let's see if we can add live unit testing in here. It would be nice to see live unit testing also giving us real fast feedback. I didn't try it with a Blazor application before. I tried it in so many other things, but it would be interesting to see this working for it. I don't see a reason why it wouldn't, but let's see. All right. So we have this stuff. Now let's go and make that test pass. Let's make that test pass. Let's go in here and say for my student component, let's go and say override on initialize. And in here I'm going to go and say my state, this dot state equals component state dot content. So that's the first thing I want to do. Component state dot content. Okay, I have this guy. And then on the front end in here, I want to go and say label or placeholder name, and I'm going to add a reference in here, and this reference will reference the student text box in here. So now I built the connection between the student text box and this local instance that I have, the class property. And this is how I'm going to control the world, and this is how I'm going to know how my component is doing with C# testing without having to go and parse the markup and the HTML and none of that stuff. None of that stuff at all. Fully C# based web UI development. I don't know. Is that going to work? I don't know. Let's find out. Let's go in here in the logic and let's do Control RT like this. And this guy is passing. What does that mean? I'm testing my UI. I'm testing my UI. That means if I run my application here, I am fully confident that I'm going to see a text box. Oh, actually, I need to reference that. Sorry, before I only tested the component. Let's throw that on the page so I can show you what's going on. So if I go here and say this is the student form component, which obviously I can go in here and say, obviously we don't want our components to be referenced all over the place, so it's useful to do it this way. But this is my student form component, and if you don't have any input parameters for the component, please just close it like this. Don't make a big mess in your UI. Make sure that your code is beautiful and easy and simple to use. So let's just run this guy. Here we go. I should be able to see a text box that has name in the placeholder. Second, might be missing something. 1 sec. Let's just rebuild my solution here. Here we go. And then let's run again. Here you go. So I have this text box, and the text box has name in it. It has name in it. I think there's a big reason. Sometimes it'll error out with you like this. I need to let me clean solution. I don't like it when it errors out like that. So let's make sure we are at the right place. Yeah, there you go. A little bit of cleanup, and then you have this name, and you can type some stuff in there. That means that if anyone goes and changes your UI, plays around with your UI, let's go in here in your student component and let's say whatever. That means that your tests will immediately complain because you have changed your UI without test driving it. If I run like this guy will error out, and it'll say this is erroring out because, let's see, this is erroring out because I expected your placeholder to be name, but found whatever. Right? You can also fake errors, you can fake exceptions and all that kind of stuff, which is gonna be what the next session is gonna be. Throughout this series that I'm gonna be working on with you, I want you to understand a couple of things. You don't have to know anything about UI or web or any of that stuff. More importantly, a lot of the beautiful UI that you see on the web is very likely a pre-built component that you're just using. And because we're building these base components, you can actually abstract away all of that work, completely abstract that stuff away, and you could just use these components, and just you want to make sure you place them in the right place at the right time. Now, I'm going to push this out because it is actually a part of a project that I want people to use. I'm going to keep that in here just for reference, but let's just go ahead and add this to GitHub so everyone could benefit from it. Let's go into GitHub, publish to GitHub. And I'm going to call this OtripleS portal. Yes, yes, yes. And then let's see if I have to ignore a few things. I think there's a couple of things I have to ignore before I go with that. So let's go home, changes. Let's see. Yeah, let's add this project to GitHub first. Publish to GitHub, OtripleS publish. I want you to see the entire process. Even adding the little code to GitHub, I want you to see it. I want you to benefit from it. So there's this guy, and then all of this is published to GitHub. So if I go into GitHub and here, repositories, OtripleS portal, you have the test, unit test, you have the web application, you have everything you need. You have everything you need, right? This is all the stuff you need. This is great. This is all great. All right, cool. It didn't publish bin or org or any of that stuff. Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, so this is a great initial state for building a Blazor application. I really want you to, take a look at that and pay attention to that because it's very, very important. And hopefully in the next sessions, we will talk a little bit about, a fully end-to-end development where you get to see how things, we're just going to, build simple CRUD operations, right? I want to retrieve all the students. I want to be able to edit a student. I want to be able to add a student. I want to be able to, update a student record. I want to be able to delete a student record. How all of this is going to work out, and how can you render that? And as soon as you harness that power, with patience, I've seen a lot of people are a little bit not too patient with learning about a technology on architecture. But if you're patient and you're willing and you have the will and the wit, to be able to go there and actually, learn that technology, you will eventually become a full stack engineer, industrial full stack engineer, meaning that you can actually test drive and build applications end to end, whether it's mobile, web, or APIs. And there will be another series where I start talking about, mobile applications development with Xamarin. And I can't wait to just, transfer all that knowledge and all that experience over to you so you can build great applications and hopefully, make your own world and the world of the people around you a better place. Thank you so much for watching. Like always, if you have any questions or comments or concerns, please feel free to drop a comment in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.